Good afternoon. I am Suzanne Lawson with Constellation Consulting, and we are pleased to present the New Mexico 2021 Summit on Health Equity. The summit is funded by the New Mexico Department of Health Tobacco Use Prevention and Control Program and will take place throughout May on our event app with live sessions each Wednesday afternoon. For more information about the summit, please visit our website at nmhealthequity.org. Due to COVID-19, this year's Summit on Health Equity remains an online event. We appreciate those who have participated and supported this year's event, including the New Mexico Department of Health, our Summit Planning Team, Presbyterian Healthcare Services, Conalma Health Foundation, BeWell NM, the Santa Fe Community Foundation, and others. For a full list of our supporters and online exhibitors, please visit our event dashboard online or on the Whova app. I also encourage you all to utilize this year's Summit on Health Equity event app. The Whova app provides you all with opportunities to network online, schedule COVID-safe meetups, create discussion groups, visit our exhibitors and supporters, watch recordings of sessions you may have missed, download files provided by our presenters, and more. It is a great tool for you to use not only during our live sessions, but also throughout the month. Plus, when you use the app, you can earn points, which could mean prizes. Please check the leaderboard in Whova for more information. For our session today, attendees' webcams and microphones have been disabled. If you have a question for today's presenter, please use the Q&A function within Whova, and we will address as many questions as time allows during the Q&A. Also, any materials provided by today's presenter will be posted as part of this session within the event app. If you need assistance during this session, please utilize the Q&A feature or Ask the Organizers feature in Whova. You may also try emailing us directly at info@constellationnm.com. For today's session, we appreciate if you take a few moments to complete our session feedback by clicking Rate in this session of the Whova app. If you would like to request community health worker or social worker CEUs or continuing medical education units, please include your name and email address on your evaluation. And our CEU certificates will be emailed out within 60 days. If you need assistance with CEUs, please email us at info@constellationnm.com. Finally, before we begin today, Constellation Consulting acknowledges that our organization operates primarily on the unceded ancestral homelands of the Tiwa-speaking peoples. Racism has no place in our communities. Constellation Consulting and our team members are committed to racial equity. We acknowledge and denounce the violence and discrimination affecting the Black and Asian and Pacific Islander communities, with whom we stand in solidarity. We are New Mexico, and we were built strong by the diverse people of our communities. There are a variety of organizations supporting health equity throughout our state. We have listed just a few here and encourage each of you to seek out, learn more, become involved with, and support organizations who are building a better New Mexico for us all. Today, we are excited to host Jessie Calero, who is a lifelong resident of New Mexico and earned her Bachelor and Master of Arts degrees from the University of New Mexico. With over 15 years of experience in government and nonprofit disability programs, Jessie currently serves as the Director of Development within a disability organization based in the South Valley of Albuquerque. As an autistic woman, Jessie provides training focused on ableism and its impacts to organizations that want to prioritize accessibility, inclusivity, and universal design. You can read all of our presenters' complete bios in our event app and on our website at nmhealthequity.org. Please welcome Jessie Calero.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for providing me with the opportunity to speak to you all today. I'm really excited to talk about the many things that this conference has brought into the conversation around health equity. And I'm also thrilled to bring disability inclusion and accessibility and beginning to deconstruct ableism in our communities into the conversation. So I'm thrilled to be a part of this, and I hope that what I share will be of value to all of you today. And I'm excited to hear your questions and to see how this content will be valuable for you moving forward. So just to introduce myself briefly, I am an autistic woman and I use she, her, hers pronouns. I'm also a nonprofit professional and I do a lot of freelance training and writing in my spare time. I have a lot of passions that I love to learn more about and share that knowledge with others. I have over 15 years experience in disability services, both on the nonprofit and government side of services. And I received my Master of Arts in Education from the University of New Mexico. Generally, I encourage participants in my sessions to introduce themselves in the chat, so please feel free to do so. And consider including your pronouns and also a land acknowledgement of where you're located and where those lands fall in terms of the indigenous peoples who first inhabited those as you introduce yourself to your fellow learners. I also encourage participants to think about what their goals for learning today are and what their areas of interest are, and keep those in mind as you ask questions so that I can really meet your educational needs as I cover the content I've prepared. At the end of the session, I'll be happy to review questions and to try to cover the areas that are most meaningful to you. And then I also encourage participants to reach out if there are areas of interest that you're passionate about, that you want to learn more about, or that you would like to share with your colleagues. I'm always willing to kind of do a deeper dive on a more individual basis. Just to sort of set the groundwork around what our goals are for the content I'll be covering, I really would like to increase the community's knowledge around the disability community and the culture of disability. Also understanding the historical philosophies, attitudes, and cultural movements that have shaped how we approach disability as a society today, and some of the areas where that can be problematic because of those attitudes and movements. I also like to bring an understanding and attention to the intersections between ableism and racism, as well as help people have increased capacity to identify ableist behavior or language and shift that to a better alternative. I also hope that this work will help the people who are participating identify barriers, either in their organization, within their own life, that are created for people with disabilities, and improve that accessibility and remove those barriers. Some of the goals that I have, or that the outcomes that I hope will occur, are that providers will understand and validate the disabled experience as they're interacting and hopefully providing trauma-informed care to disabled community members, as well as better meet the needs of disabled community members who identify as Black, Indigenous, or people of color, and looking at the intersections of those identities. I also hope that providers will be able to prevent or identify and address subtle acts of exclusion, ways in which we other people with disabilities and how to prevent that, as well as overall that disabled community members will experience increased quality of care and access in our state. So I hope that those goals are relevant to the work that you all are doing, and that this will be valuable for you moving forward. Starting from the ground level and addressing the relevance of disability, many people in a variety of fields, if they're not directly serving people with disabilities in their work, wonder, what is the relevance to me? But disability really doesn't occur in a vacuum. Almost a quarter of Americans have some type of disability. And one thing that we rarely think about is that disability doesn't discriminate based on income, social status, race, ethnicity, religion, age, sexual orientation, gender identity. There are members of all of those communities and identities that experience disability. But at the same time, access to healthcare, interventions, general supports is deeply influenced by those factors. Generally, people who come from a variety of marginalized identities do not have the same equitable access to the support they need as a disabled person. People who identify as BIPOC or LGBTQ face far greater barriers in the community than, say, someone like me who is disabled, but for one point has an invisible disability. I am able to generally pass in the community as abled, and on the other hand is also white, and so has a significant amount of privilege with that as well. Many people have societal conceptions of what disability should look like, And oftentimes in that conversation, people picture one, children, which disabled people do become adults, and two, they tend to picture a white person. And so acknowledging that disability crosses all identities and intersects with those identities is important. Another thing I usually like to draw attention to is that even those who are not born with a congenital disability, who don't currently identify as disabled, could develop a disability at any point in their lives, whether due to an injury, due to the aging process, or due to an illness of some kind. All of us may experience a disability, and many people do experience disability to varying degrees across the course of their lifetime. One area that I really like to acknowledge as I'm discussing disability rights and ableism and moving towards a more inclusive society is how significant a role the civil rights movement has played in providing people with disabilities with access and inclusion. A number of the rights that people with disabilities enjoy today were really made possible through the civil rights movement. And in fact, many of the initial sit-ins that were focused on disability rights and led by disabled community members were in large part supported by groups like the Black Panthers. And in this photo that I've shown, which pictures a Black man sitting at a microphone in a wheelchair accompanied by a white woman, this picture shows Bradley Lomax, who was a Black Panther with multiple sclerosis and was very active in not only advocating for the rights of Black citizens, but also for the rights of those with disabilities. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that work and to realize how significant that has been and how that has benefited all disabled Americans. One of the things that is sort of a misconception in general society is that disability rights begin and end with the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And while the ADA plays an incredibly important role in affirming the rights of people with disabilities enjoy the same rights as all citizens. The ADA was simply a necessary tool to enforce some, but not all of those rights. And so thinking of the ADA as sort of the very ground level of what rights people with disabilities have, of physical access, of accommodations, and then moving forward and seeing people with disabilities as whole and valued members of our community is deeply important. In terms of many of the people in the room here today who are in the healthcare field, who are providers, who support health equity in New Mexico, some things that we can think about in terms of honoring the rights of disabled care recipients and being active in addressing their needs. I kind of have a couple of bullet points that really sum up what should be at the top of our minds. And one of those is providing accommodations as required by the ADA, so ensuring that a physical space is accessible. But furthermore, acknowledging that the sensory environment can be a huge piece of that, and we will dive further into that as we move forward. Providing access to information about people receiving healthcare that is communicated in an accessible way. So ensuring that your communication is not purely verbal or even purely written. Many individuals with disabilities are unable to read. So how can visuals and other modes of communication be incorporated into a person's healthcare communications? Ensuring that people have access to interpreters, whether that is sign language or a second language besides English. And then centering the patient in all of the decisions that are made, in all of the communications, and in all of the care that is provided. Furthermore, keeping in mind that trauma-informed care becomes incredibly important for people with disabilities. Among the disability community, there's ongoing conversations about the fact that we don't necessarily know what it looks like to be an adult with a disability without a significant trauma history, whether that is because of abuse, neglect, exploitation, childhood bullying, abusive means of changing behaviors. things of that nature, where most people with disabilities who live to adulthood have a significant trauma history that they carry with them into healthcare spaces. And so in acknowledging that, we also need to consider the impact of that in emergency situations. And so whether it's providing emergency ambulance services, interacting with the police, that baggage is carried with a person. And that also intersects with identities. Many community members don't realize that people with disabilities are 30% more likely to be arrested than a non-disabled community member. And furthermore, Black disabled folks are twice as likely to be arrested compared to their white counterparts. And so especially in the environment we're currently in, where we're looking at police violence and its impacts, this has massive implications for people with disabilities. And so that's something that needs to be acknowledged and considered as we address and reform emergency response in a variety of situations. There are also a lot of implications around preventing institutionalization, keeping people with disabilities in the homes and settings of their choice, rather than warehousing or removing them from communities. And then considering how ableism and bias influence conversations around quality of life, which is very relevant to the healthcare field and is something we are going to dive further into as well. So sort of looking at the expanse of disability, disability can be a broad term that encompasses so many different experiences and can encompass multiple experiences. People with disabilities may experience one or more area of support need. And so looking at the breadth of disability, the ADA specifically defines a person with a disability as someone who has a physical or a mental impairment that limits one or more major life activity. So if you consider that, that's a pretty broad definition. And the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which influences access to accommodations and support in the school system, categorizes disability using the graphic I've shown above, which shows a blue icon that says disability categories and then lists a variety of areas of disability, which I'm going to list. So the range of disabilities you may encounter when working with disabled community members includes autism, deaf-blindness, deafness, a developmental delay, emotional disturbance, which is kind of an ongoing problematic heading that kind of is a catch-all for a variety of mental health diagnoses that the school currently uses. I'm hoping that that language will shift and be more clear and more inclusive and have less of a negative connotation. Hearing impairment, intellectual disability, visual impairment, traumatic brain injury, speech or language impairment, specific learning disability, other health impairment, orthopedic impairment, or multiple disabilities. So this is again how the IDEA categorizes disability. And these categories are not perfect. Some of the language is not ideal. Some of the categorization is not ideal. However, this gives you a really good idea of how broad disability is and what types of disabilities we need to be thinking about when we are considering issues of access and equity. In terms of implications for responding to the support needs of an individual person with a disability, some of the things that I like to think about and questions I'm going to ask to sort of engage you in a little bit of thought and just sort of marinate on as we continue are, what are some of the ways a person's disability, whether visible or invisible, might impact the way you would communicate with them or how they would communicate with or react to a healthcare provider. So considering, as a provider, how does that influence my interaction with the person with a disability? And as a person with a disability, how might their different diagnoses and their different experience of the world impact the way that they connect with and communicate with me? Furthermore, how does a person with a disability identify themselves to a provider? Is it always necessary to disclose a disability to a provider? if it's not relevant to the issue at hand? And then how would knowing a person is disabled impact the way you would approach them or interact with them, and why? What would the impact be if you were to treat everyone as though they may have a disability, and be cognizant of, this is a person who may be disabled and I may need to meet their support needs. If a person is not disabled, is there anything about that philosophy or attitude that would negatively impact their care? So those are some sort of rhetorical questions, although very broad and could be deep dives in and of themselves for all of us to consider as we continue to cover this content. I've been using the term ableism quite frequently in my presentation, and I like to provide a pretty focused definition of what that means. It's a term that's very new for many people. We're all familiar with the word racism and what that means in society, but many of us are new to the world of ableism. And so I like to use the definition that was created collaboratively by Talila Lewis. She worked with disabled Black and other BIPOC individuals to create this definition, and specifically disabled Black and BIPOC individuals. And their definition for ableism was a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normality, intelligence, excellence, desirability, and productivity. And so thinking about that, obviously, the second part, the sort of expansion on this definition that states that these ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism, that really aligns quite perfectly. It really shows the way those two, this set of ideas of what people should be and the philosophies behind why people are so ingrained in the belief that people should be that way and that they are most valuable when they have those characteristics, it really aligns and makes sense. Overall, further outlining Talila Lewis's definition, it says, this form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's language, appearance, religion, and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. And you do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. And that's something that I'm hoping as we continue in this conversation, we'll be able to identify, no matter whether you identify as disabled or not. So really looking at the ways in which ableism and racism are intertwined, we can really see the root in white supremacy culture, in which a person's value is measured based on criteria that are completely outside of their control. And so with Talila's connection of building this sort of discomfort with people with disability around a sort of a connection to capitalism, of who has value is based on what they produce and contribute, and what products and contributions are valuable. Because I would argue that people with disabilities absolutely produce and contribute both culturally and economically to our society. But there are ways in which we decide what is valuable and what is not. And that can box people with disabilities out of the cultural and economic conversations. A lot of this is very deeply connected to the Industrial Revolution, which really focused on produce. How many hours can you work? How many items can you create during that time? People working in factories and doing rote tasks at a certain speed, and the expectation being that that speed would continue and continue to increase, and that production would continue and continue to increase. Some other areas where these philosophies intersect are with eugenics movements where people with certain characteristics, both physical and intellectual, were considered highly superior to others, and that those superior individuals should be the only ones who should be allowed to reproduce. And so not that long ago, there was considerable sterilization without consent, especially among women with significant disabilities. And there was a lot of medical experimentation and other unethical and discriminatory practices that occurred that deeply impacted, 1, disabled people, 2, disabled people of color, and 3, people of color in general. And when you look at the history of racism, much of the justification around damaging and racist behavior was made based on implying that people of color were of inferior intellect, or did not experience the world in the same way as their white counterparts, which in and of itself is essentially implying that people of color are all inherently disabled or intellectually inferior, and that because of that, they have less value. So a lot of the roots of our society's focus on racism is interconnected with themes of disability. Another area of growth in our society that is considered to have been distant past, but is still very much present and real in our country, is institutionalization. And again, this, I guess, societal philosophy that people with disabilities needed to be separated from the community and placed in isolated settings is one that deeply impacted Black, Indigenous, and people of color community members, as they were the ones who were most likely to be institutionalized, versus many white disabled people were kept with their families either because of economic resources or because of some of the lack of discrimination that can occur. When you look at abuse, neglect, exploitation, and violence, these things occurred to an incredible degree in institutions. And many times these things were justified based on a lot of these value systems and movements of eugenics, of valuing capitalism above all else, of placing people in warehouses. So one thing that I like to point out to community members as I go over this content is that anti-racism training and practice positively impacts accessibility and inclusion. When we engage in anti-racist work, it positively impacts our anti-ableist work. And that anti-ableist training and practice also increases safety and accessibility for other communities. For example, if an organization focuses on making all of their signage and communications accessible to people who do not read, they are also impacting English language learners who may read, but may not read or read fluently in English. Another example is accessible restrooms. A person with a disability who needs assistance in the restroom may have a care provider accompanying them who is of the opposite gender. And so when accessing the restrooms and providing that support there, it can be difficult to decide what restroom do we use and how do we make sure everyone is comfortable. Furthermore, people with disabilities also identify as LGBTQ, and including that as trans. There are trans disabled members of our communities. And so when we provide gender inclusive restrooms that are safe and accessible, we're impacting all of these communities positively. Some ableist language that I like to highlight in our society. Unfortunately, a lot of this is really deeply ingrained in the terms that we use every day, and it can be very difficult to unlearn. I think that as a society, we're understanding more significantly the impact of language and how the way we speak about something influences the way we think about something, and that influences the way we behave, and that no language sort of occurs in a vacuum. And so looking at ableist language that we often see, of course, there are words like crazy or insane, psycho, spaz. These are all words that are directly related to mental health diagnoses, to intellectual disabilities, making jokes about, oh, I'm so OCD, you know, sort of making light of a person's disability and claiming that for ourselves when it might be I'm very organized, or I enjoy keeping a tight schedule and following the same patterns every day. Those can be true for abled community members, but it's not really appropriate for us to joke about and take on diagnostic language as we're speaking about our preferences. Other words, generally what's referred to as the R word, it has been largely removed from society, but there are still times when we hear that word. Other words like lame, crippled, vegetable, invalid, all of these words are deeply hurtful and all have roots in criticizing, demeaning, and othering people with disabilities. I won't dive into every single example of ableist language, but I want all of us to sort of contemplate how often we have used this language. I, as a disabled person raised in an ableist society, have used this language and am continuing to unlearn it. But how can we remove that from our dialogue and make a conscious choice about examining our own language? Another really common example that many people do not realize is inappropriate is to use the term wheelchair bound. And one of the reasons that that's so problematic is many wheelchair users speak about how their wheelchair is not something that they are bound to or confined by, but is in fact adaptive equipment that allows them the access they do have to society. So it's a very freeing piece of equipment that allows them to do things they would otherwise not be able to do. And many abled people see it as a restriction in some way, which just isn't accurate. Another sort of area to bring attention to is phrases like blind spot. That's one that I hear pretty often of, oh my goodness, that's a blind spot for me. When in reality, what people really are saying is, wow, that's really an area of growth, or that's something I haven't focused on, or that's something I don't know a lot about. Other phrases like falling on deaf ears, tone deaf, even saying the phrase throwing a fit. I think many parents have said that phrase and have used that language, when throwing a fit is really a reference to having a seizure. And it's probably not the most positive language to use about children. So instead saying, my kid is having a really tough day, that is a lot more appropriate and inclusive than using that language. Many times we say, gosh, I'm just losing my mind, I can't remember anything. That's language we don't need to use. We could say, I'm experiencing so much stress right now, I feel like I can't remember everything I need to. Many of these words are used because ableism really sees disability as negative and as something to demean and as something that indicates a lack of value. And so something that's occurred in the abled community is that people see the word disabled as a bad or negative word and try to use euphemisms to sort of talk around disability without actually saying that word, when in reality, the vast majority of disabled adults prefer to be referred to as disabled. Some examples of these euphemisms are special needs, handicapped, or my absolute favorite, which I despise, is differently abled. These are all attempts to be sensitive, but in fact create and reinforce the idea that disability and the word disabled are negative. Some things to also think about that have shifted in the disabled community is a focus on person-first language. This is something that's becoming more and more common in society, is that people say, well, we should say person with a disability, person with autism, person with Down syndrome, rather than focusing on their disability. And that, again, is an attempt to be sensitive. And for some disabled community members, that is their general preference. However, many people with disabilities actually prefer identity-first language. I personally prefer identity-first language because it really my disability plays such a massive role in who I am, how I interact with the world. It is a part of my core identity. It is a part of what makes me who I am. And so to erase it by saying I'm a person with autism, some of the best comparisons I've seen is to say, oh, it's a person with lesbian. Well, no, this person identifies as a lesbian. It's not a condition or something to be ashamed of or something they chose. It is a core part of who they are. And so using that language in a way that honors that person's preferences is something that we can really shift and begin to ask people when you are speaking about a person's disability or their identity, asking them, how do you prefer for me to speak about you? That I think is becoming more common as we're becoming more comfortable with sharing our gender pronouns and ensuring that we never make assumptions about others. That philosophy and that willingness to ask and to ensure that you are honoring a person's identity and preferences and who they are is something that impacts a variety of communities. Another thing to think about is to avoid a lot of the language that is categorized in the disability community as inspiration porn. And what inspiration porn is celebrating sort of day-to-day victories being in quotes, among people with disabilities that are fairly run-of-the-mill for abled communities. But instead of acknowledging, look, here are all the barriers society places in front of this person with a disability and they accomplished X anyway, it's celebrating, oh, look at this incredible charity case. They worked so hard and they were so brave and they accomplished all of these things. You're focusing on, you know, the person with a disability being some sort of mythical hero or incredible, when you should be focusing on why do we ask so much of people with disabilities, have them jump through what feel like impossible hoops, rather than just creating increased access, rather than just making life equitable for them. And so some examples would be, for example, when I went to high school, a young man with Down syndrome was elected our homecoming king. And there was lots of news coverage of it. And all of it was focused on, wow, this is such an incredible student body that they chose this young man for homecoming king. Rather than acknowledging, hey, the reason he was selected as homecoming king is because he's incredibly kind, always connecting with others, so social, so funny, very fun to be around. That wasn't the focus. It was on, oh, these abled students decided to take pity on a disabled member of their school. When in reality, maybe the conversation should have been, why do we assume that a disabled person being popular is an impossibility or is a charity case? Why is that so difficult for anyone to believe? And so shifting those narratives and looking at who the audience is content around disability created by and for disabled people, or is it created for the abled gaze, is a good thing to think about when you're identifying inspiration porn, and something that's incredibly rampant in disability nonprofits. Other things to think about in terms of ableist language is to always speak to and about people with disabilities as though they are the age that they are. So basically treat them like human beings. If someone is a child with a disability, it's appropriate to speak to them as though they are a child. If someone is a 34-year-old with a disability, it is highly inappropriate and ableist to speak to them as though they are a child, no matter their disability. And then one thing that happens quite a bit on social media is that parents of children with disabilities often take it upon themselves to correct the way disabled adults choose to speak about themselves, using identity first language, embracing the term disability, really celebrating their identity rather than seeing it as a negative or a drawback. So one thing that I always encourage people to do is to never correct the way anyone chooses to speak about their own identity. Some areas of etiquette that are important for everyone, let alone healthcare providers, are to ensure that you're not helping someone with a disability without explicit permission. So running to grab and open doors, grabbing things out of a disabled person's arm, pushing them in their wheelchair, putting your arm around a blind person to guide them, none of those things are appropriate without permission. And furthermore, it's vastly inappropriate to touch a person or their assistive devices without permission. In the way that I move in disability spaces, anything that is an assistive device, I consider a part of a person's body. So that could be glasses, or it could be a wheelchair, it could be a walker, crutches, canes, a communication device, which might be their iPad or iPhone. All of those things I consider to be a part of that person's body, and I would never take it upon myself to touch it without permission. One thing that abled people love to do is that as soon as a person who needs mobility assistance sits down, they are like, we better hide the mobility aids. We better put these crutches in a closet and put this cane in the corner and roll their wheelchair away and hide any indication that they have a disability. It's just so uncomfortable and embarrassing. And then you are in fact stranding that person on the island of wherever they chose to sit. And so that's something I see so frequently and is so inappropriate that many able people do not even consider. Another thing that can be difficult to navigate is many able people will demand that iPhones, iPads, things like that can't be out in some settings, which totally removes a person's ability to communicate. Many times people with ADHD and people who identify as autistic actually use these devices to pay attention. And so oftentimes when you say there are absolutely no phones in this setting, you are removing their ability to communicate, to take notes, to use apps on their phone to self-regulate their sensory system, or to allow them to pay attention. I myself can often pay much better attention if I have something that I am doing that is unrelated. I can focus more heavily on what's being told to me, which seems counterintuitive. And so some of those decisions that we make that are based on abled ways of learning really disrupt people with disabilities. Another thing that I see quite frequently is that an individual with a disability who's accompanied by an aid of some kind, whether it's a personal care aid, someone who assists with communication, whoever it is they're interacting with often begins communicating directly with that aid rather than speaking to the person with the disability. And so we really need to make sure that we are always addressing the person concerned. So in a healthcare appointment, if someone has a personal care aide or a parent present, or even an interpreter, it is so important to continue to speak to that individual and not any support provider in the room. That care is about them and for them, and it needs to be a conversation with them. Another thing to really consider is that in society with people with disabilities, the default is often to presume that someone is incompetent. And when, as members of the community, we interact with people who appear to be abled, there is a presumed competence. We do not assume that people cannot open a door by themselves or that they are unable to communicate their healthcare preferences. We often, with people with disabilities, presume that they cannot do those things independently or that they are not able to participate in those conversations. So that's something to really examine, is how can I practice presuming that a person is able to do everything that an abled person could, and then if they request support, or if I see something that may be a support need and I offer support, they take me up on it, then filling those gaps, but not starting from a place of this person is unable to fill in the blank. Another thing that I've seen quite frequently, both in therapeutic sessions, in recreation, or in therapeutic settings, in recreational settings, and even in business settings, is requiring eye contact, which can be borderline painful for autistic people and is also more culturally inclusive. There are many cultures in which eye contact is actually extremely aggressive and rude and inappropriate. But then also understanding that eye contact might be more important in other communities. For example, in deaf culture, there are components of eye contact and facial expressions that impact the grammar of what a person is actually expressing. And so ensuring that you're just being cognizant of those different spaces and needs. Another thing to consider, which is especially true for me, is that many autistic people cannot process more than one source of sensory input at the same time. So if I am making really great eye contact, in fact, I may actually not be listening to you because all I'm focusing on is making eye contact with you. I can't focus on that and process the sensory input of what you are telling me. And so while I have sort of been trained by society to try to make eye contact as frequently as possible, I actually am a far better listener if I am looking at something else. And so oftentimes in conversations, my eyes wander, and many people assume that that means that I am not listening, but in fact, it often means I am listening far more closely than if I were making eye contact. And so other sensory input can disrupt that as well. So for example, if I am very, very hot or very, very cold, I find it very difficult to understand what someone is saying to me. If I'm at a party and there is music and talking in the background and someone is speaking to me, it is very rare that I can hear what they said the first time, really at all. And so something that I've really noticed in the pandemic is that with masks, a lot of times I am more than ever unable to understand what someone says, not because of my functional hearing, but because I relied so much on lip reading because my auditory processing is so delayed that lip reading was actually augmenting my communication. And so I have had a lot of struggles in the pandemic of not being able to fully understand someone when they're wearing a mask. And it can be, you can get a lot of abrasive responses when you ask someone to repeat themselves more than once. And so in talking to another autistic friend, we talked about how we've had to start phrasing things differently when we ask someone to repeat themselves, because she's had the same struggle I have of saying, I'm sorry, I have a hard time hearing, which isn't necessarily true. I'm not telling that person I am deaf, but it is very true. I have a hard time hearing what is passing through. My body is able to hear things perfectly, but my brain processes things differently and more slowly. And so not being able to lip read has delayed that significantly. And honestly, society is more accepting of saying, I have a hard time hearing, than saying, I'm sorry, I'm autistic. I really can't figure out what you're saying. You'll need to say it 2 or 3 more times. Something to really also keep in mind is to believe and respect disclosure. Many times when someone shares with another person that they have a disability, the responses can be focused on how can you prove to me you have a disability, especially for people who have invisible disabilities. And then on the other hand, acknowledging the privilege inherent in choosing whether or not to disclose a disability. Many people with disabilities do not get that privilege. Their disability is very apparent the moment someone sees them, and so they don't get to decide whether they disclose or not. And so thinking about those things and how those impact a person's interactions with society is important. Another thing I see quite a bit is requiring verbal communication to access services. An example I can think of is a woman who I have worked with for years and years was opening her own small business and communicates non-verbally. She uses an augmentative communication device. And she was not able to open a bank account for her small business, even though she had all the paperwork she needed. Her guardian was present to assist in signing off on any needed paperwork. That bank told her, we will not allow you to open an account unless you can say verbally yes to the teller who is opening the account. It couldn't be written, it couldn't be communicated using a device. Her guardian was not allowed to communicate it. And so that was basically discriminating against her because she could not verbally say yes. And so those are practices that are 1, illegal, but 2, highly offensive and dismissive of the different ways people with disabilities find to communicate and navigate society. Another thing to keep in mind is that we should always center the lived experiences of people with disabilities, not their parents, not their siblings, not their therapists, not their healthcare providers. And unfortunately, in disability spaces, that has become so much the norm. So many of us have heard of people who identify as special needs moms, which is probably as problematic as someone identifying as having experienced the Black experience as a white person with a Black child. It doesn't work that way. You may see the way disability and society interact as a parent of a child with a disability, the same way as a mother, you might see how your child's race influences their life if they are Black and you are white. But that does not mean you understand or identify as that, a part of that community. It does not mean you can claim that as part of your own identity. And so if we can center disabled people in those conversations and acknowledge that parents, clinicians do have areas where they have expertise, they have knowledge, but do not allow them to overshadow their family members, care recipients, what have you. When we do that, we are really honoring people with disabilities and centering them in spaces. I think there's also, moving in a different direction, a lot of misunderstandings around accommodations, especially around service animals. People assume, oh, if you have a service animal, you have some sort of ID that says what disability you have, what the service animal does, proof that you can bring them into this space. When in fact, there are only 2 questions that you can ask an individual who uses a service dog. And there's no ID card, there's no license, there's nothing they have to provide you. But you are able to ask, is this animal required because of a disability? And then what work or tasks is the animal trained to perform? Anything outside of that is really violating their rights. You are not allowed to demand what their disability is. And many times people confuse service dogs with emotional support dogs, or animals, I should say more broadly. Service animals perform work, whether it's alerting someone of an impending seizure, providing seeing eye assistance in navigating, work that is ongoing and that they are trained to complete. Versus an emotional support animal may help with sensory or emotional regulation. It may help a person feel safe, but that dog's presence is what's providing the support rather than tasks that they are trained to complete. Something I also like to draw attention to since the COVID-19 pandemic's onset is the ways in which the coronavirus has specifically impacted people with disabilities. People with disabilities, because there are misconceptions in society about what work they are capable of doing, are often in entry-level positions and are considered expendable to a certain degree. And so these were the first to experience layoffs and furloughs, and they'll be among the last to return to work. Many have been invited to return to work, but have not had access to vaccination and have underlying health conditions that put them at significant risk for the impacts of COVID-19. There are also sort of catch-22s in terms of housing. In New Mexico, people with disabilities really kind of have only a few options in terms of where they live. They either live with family or surrogate family. They live in institutions or hospitals or nursing homes of some kind, or intermediate care facilities, sort of massive group settings, or they live in group homes where they live with 2 or 3 other people with disabilities as roommates. Now, when the public health orders were rolled out, what were the most at-risk settings? Congregate settings. So intermediate care facilities, nursing homes, hospitals, group homes, prisons. And so people with disabilities, besides living with family, only have access to congregate care, but then are told, well, you chose a high-risk setting to live in. And so now you will not see your family for 9 months to a year, which is what occurred. Now, while I'm totally in favor of keeping people safe, I'm even more in favor of giving people far wider options in terms of housing and settings to live in. And so this is one situation in which having limited options really negatively impacted people with disabilities. Another thing to think about is access to technology and accessible online education and support. Many people with disabilities, there is not a focus on teaching them computer literacy. And hopefully that is shifting as education is improving and there's less segregation between abled and disabled students. But many of the populations that I work with really struggled with a transition to being more technology reliant because it was something that was new to them or that they did not have financial access to. Another thing to think about is that online education is a very, it's focused on either an auditory learner or a learner who reads content rather than kinesthetic learners and visual learners who need to see lots of different ways of approaching a problem or learning a concept, who need conversational learning where it's very interactive and part of a community of learning. While there are a lot of great things about Zoom, it can feel very one-sided and it doesn't really engage all pieces of a person. And so that can leave people out of the mix. Some of the flexibility and accommodations that all of us have enjoyed because of COVID, some of the little silver linings we've all tried to find, like, you know, doing a Target pickup, just driving in, ordering having what you need that you've ordered ready to go and driving away. Some of those things are things that people with disabilities have asked for and needed for years and years, and were only made ubiquitous at small and large businesses because of the pandemic. And some of the concerns are that a lot of these accommodations will disappear as the pandemic resolves. You think about how disabled people have fought for education, school, and work access where they could or in medical care where they could access these systems from home, and they were told it was utterly impossible. And it only became possible when it impacted the abled part of society. Some of the other things that we've seen in this time is some of the healthcare disparities and discrimination that are based around the medical field's idea of what quality of life is. There are examples in the United Kingdom and the US of people with disabilities being deemed as having a poor quality of life and not receiving care when they were diagnosed with COVID-19 and hospitalized. Situations in which people with disabilities were immediately asked to sign DNR, do not resuscitate orders, and things, change their advanced directives because the medical field wanted to focus on saving abled people, because disabled people, they're just not as valuable. They just don't contribute as much. They just don't enjoy life to the fullest, to the same degree. And so COVID-19 life-saving measures should be focused on abled populations. It's based in deciding who is valuable on criteria that no one controls. There was a man in Texas who also happened to be Black, who was left to die in the hospital. All care was stripped from him, and he died of COVID-19 because the doctor said, well, you know, he has significant paralysis that existed when he came in, so his life is less valuable. And I'm sure being Black also influenced that. As a white disabled person, is your care and what people assume your quality of life is different? Those are all things to consider in the healthcare field. Some of the access implications that we think about in terms of physical space. Many times when you think of physical accessibility, people immediately think elevators, ramps, things of that nature, automatic doors. Those are all great and those all increase accessibility, but that's really not where accessibility to a physical space begins and ends. A lot of restroom design, both in terms of gender designations, being more inclusive, the size of stalls, even access to adult-sized changing tables. Many restrooms have infant-sized changing tables, but there are adults who need access to those types of equipment. Those are all things to consider. Even doorknob designs, when we think about sort of a typical, generally used in residential spaces, round doorknob, you generally grasp that doorknob and use a rotating motion in order to open the door. But if you do not have hands, if you have poor fine motor skills, if you have intense sensory sensitivity on the palms of your hands, those doorknobs can be completely inaccessible. And so generally lever doorknobs are more accessible. If I did not have hands, I could use part of my arm to press down on the door. If my palms are very sensitive, I can use the back of my hand. There are a lot of ways in which something as simple as a doorknob can determine whether someone has access. Oftentimes with automatic doors, organizations will turn them off to save electricity. So that's an example of it's there, but it's not usable. We talked about sensory environments and text-based signage, also considering where you are located in the community. These are all areas that deeply impact access. There are also a lot of things to consider in terms of service delivery. And I know that we are running out of time. Is that correct? I'm so sorry. I'll see if I can wrap this up. So there are a lot of things to think about in terms of your support models, who can access your service and how their identity impacts that access, expecting people to read between the lines in things that haven't been explicitly explained or shared, how people report inaccessibility or discrimination, and how you communicate to disabled and non-disabled people alike what accessibility features are available within your organization. How is that part of your marketing and communications plans? Finally, I'll just highlight my sources. A lot of the stuff that I have pulled from and highlighted is from incredible disabled focused social media accounts. So I have listed those as well as helpful links focused on racism, ableism, and ways in which organizations can focus on increasing their accessibility. So if there's something you would like to learn more about, please dive into the sources, and those will be shared with all of the attendees. And then finally, you're also welcome to reach out to me via email. I have my personal email and my work email there. So if there's an area that you want to talk about or something you want to learn more about or a resource that you would like to identify for your team or for yourself, I'm an open book. I try to be as accessible and helpful as possible. And so please don't be shy about connecting with me and continuing this conversation. And I'll just end by saying thank you so much for allowing me to connect with you all and to share this content. It's really important to me, and it's been a really valuable experience.
Thanks so much, Jessie. We appreciate it. We do have one question. I know we're short on time, and our final session for today has actually started. So I want to make it quick for any attendees who want to go over. No worries at all. We did have one question that had come through the app previously, though, and so I did want to address that. The question was, and you did touch on this, but I guess if you could talk a little bit more about it. How do invisible disabilities factor into this discussion? So maybe you can talk a little bit more about how we as attendees to this conference can be aware of invisible disabilities and how to work with those, address those, etc.
Absolutely. I think some of that depends on the setting. When I think about invisible disabilities, I think about some of the biggest struggles occurring in education and work settings, because those are the settings where if people quote unquote mess up or miss something or are not as productive, there can be sort of a negative consequence associated with that. But especially in healthcare settings, sometimes we make those assumptions about people. When a disability is invisible, you don't automatically offer accommodations. So I think about someone, I have coworkers who have, say, a learning disability. So if they're diagnosed with a new condition and they're handed a really detailed, very helpful pamphlet, that's a lot of resources, but they may not be able to fully read and retain that information. So it might be something where they really need that extra time with their doctor, having a verbal conversation about what does this mean for me? What resources are available? How can I manage a new condition like diabetes or something like that? Another thing to think about is, you know, someone with a traumatic brain injury or with cerebral palsy, they may appear to be completely able-bodied. You may not be able to see anything about them that would indicate they have either of those diagnoses, but it may severely impact their speech. And so taking that extra time and not making negative comments about their need to articulate words more slowly, and maybe asking them to repeat themselves. Sometimes able people will just nod and say, oh yeah, I caught that. And they have no idea what the person said. And so the person is like, I'm not being listened to. Things like that that we just don't think about. And so I always, and within my organization, we have a really cool culture of, instead of immediately saying, this is a shortfall or a misstep or a lack of effort or work or integrity on this person's part, assuming this is probably a support need. Maybe they missed this because I sent it via email instead of talking to them on the phone. Maybe they need assistance with X training, things like that, where if you look at every person, whether abled or disabled, has support needs, and sort of start from that level of how can I accommodate their learning style or what might be an invisible disability or may not, I feel like it impacts everyone positively to have that attitude.
Got it. Thank you. So thanks so much, Jessie, for your time and expertise today. We appreciate all of your efforts towards creating true health equity in New Mexico.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of our attendees for joining us today and throughout May. Recordings for today's sessions will be posted in the Whova app soon, and these recordings, along with recordings from all of our sessions, will stay live in Whova through June 30th. On July 1st, all of this year's sessions will be available at nmhealthequity.org. Please remember to check your event dashboard for more information. And as mentioned, our final session, From Housing to Home, a Foundation of Health Equity with John Ames of HopeWorks, has just started. So have a great afternoon, everyone.